Have you ever had a moment when time seemed to stop, not because of sorrow or anger, but because of something so unexpected, it left you in stunned silence? Before I share mine, I'd love to know, where are you watching from right now? Which city, which country? Drop it in the comments below. It always amazes me how our stories, even when so personal, can somehow connect strangers across the world. Now let me take you back to the beginning. The house had grown painfully quiet after my husband Harold passed away. We had been married for 42 years, and his absence wasn't just felt in the empty space beside me in bed. It echoed through every corner of the home. The kitchen, the garage, even that creaky hallway we always laughed about. Each place carried a trace of him. His toothbrush still sat in the holder. The cardigan he always left, draped over the dining chair, hung there, untouched. On the porch table, a crossword puzzle lay unfinished, waiting for hands that would never return. I tried to fill the silence the way many widows do, reorganizing drawers that didn't need it, refolding laundry that wasn't dirty, moving jars around in the pantry. But grief cannot be scrubbed away. It lingers. It seeps into the quietest moments. Through it all, my son Stanley was a steady presence. He stopped by every few days, sometimes with groceries, sometimes just with his company. He's 42 now, strong in the same way his father once was, with hazel eyes that hold more than they reveal. After his divorce 2 years ago, he grew more inward, as if life had turned him into a man who watched and reflected, rather than rushed and reacted. One Thursday afternoon, I had just come inside from watering the plants when I heard his key turning in the lock. My heart lifted. I always did when I saw him. "You're early?" I smiled, drying my hands on a towel. He hugged me longer than usual, like he was holding on to something heavier than words. "I thought you might want some company today," he said softly. We sat in the kitchen sipping coffee while the breeze carried the scent of cut grass through the open window. Outside, a dog barked lazily, as if the world was moving on without noticing the stillness in mine. Stanley leaned forward, his hands wrapped tightly around his cup. I recognized that look. It was the same one he wore as a boy, when he needed to confess something like breaking the neighbor's window or asking to stay out past curfew. Finally, he spoke. "Mom, do you ever feel like you lost more than just Dad?" The question made my breath hitch. "What do you mean?" He hesitated. "I mean, did losing him feel like you lost a part of yourself too?" I looked down at my hands, lined, veined, trembling just a little. "Yes," I whispered. "That's exactly how it feels." He stood, walked to the window, then turned back to me. His voice was quiet, careful. "I think I lost a part of myself when you did too. You were different with Dad around, always smiling, but guarded. I felt it even as a kid. There was this wall, invisible but real. I always wanted to be closer to you, but I couldn't reach past it." Tears pricked my eyes. "Stanley." He raised his hand gently. "I don't say this to hurt you. It's just, since the funeral, I see you differently. Not just as my mother, but as you. And I want to know that person." From his pocket, he pulled out a small wooden box. I found this going through Dad's things. Inside was a photograph. I had long forgotten a black and white picture of me, in my 20s, barefoot, in the garden straw hat, tipped back, laughing like the world couldn't touch me. I traced my finger over the image. I barely recognize her. But I do, Stanley said softly. And I want her back. I want you back, Mom. His eyes were misted now. I reached for his hand and he held it tightly. The silence between us swelled not with distance, but with decades of words finally breaking free. Can I ask you something personal? He whispered. Of course, I said, my heart pounding. Would it be okay if we talked more about things we never did before? Not as mother and son, but just as two people trying to make sense of everything we lost. It wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was raw, honest, and profoundly human. He wasn't asking for anything except closeness, something real, something beyond the rigid roles we had played for so long. I nodded, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel so alone. That evening, after he left, I sat on the porch with the photograph in my hand. The woman in it looked carefree, alive, untouched by time. She was me once. And maybe, with my son's gentle insistence, she could be me again. That version of Lisa, the young woman in the old photograph, felt like a distant echo, as though she belonged to someone else entirely. A figure I admired, but one I couldn't quite remember how to be. Stanley's words had reached deeper than I wanted to admit. Not just because they came from him, but because they gave voice to something I had been silently aching for all along, to be seen, not as a widow, not as a mother, not as someone's neighbor, but simply as myself, a woman with dreams I had tucked away and thoughts I had long silenced. The next few days passed quietly. Stanley didn't call, and strangely, I wasn't hurt by it. I sensed he was giving me space, and I needed that space more than I realized. Then on Sunday afternoon, I heard a knock at the door, 2 short taps, and a pause just the way he used to do when he was a boy. I opened the door, and there he was, smiling gently. A bag of groceries in one hand, a 6-pack of root beer in the other. I brought lunch, he said, and there was something softer in his smile this time. Less guarded, we settled into the kitchen. I made sandwiches while he sliced apples, and before long, we were sitting together, knees nearly touching under the table. Between bites, he studied me quietly. "You look lighter," he said. I laughed softly. "Maybe it's just the mayonnaise." He shook his head, smirking. "No, I mean it. You seem more you." I lowered my eyes, brushing a crumb off my lap. "I've been thinking about what you said." His gaze met mine, steady and patient. "You were right," I admitted. "I did build walls. Not only with you, but with everyone. Your father was a good man, but marriage sometimes becomes more about peace than honesty. And I suppose I learned how to stay quiet, how to keep parts of myself hidden. Over time, it became easier not to be fully seen." Stanley listened with an expression I couldn't quite read, but there was tenderness in his eyes, the kind I hadn't seen since he was little. "I want to know you too," I added, not just as my son, but as Stanley, the man you've become. He blinked, visibly, moved, and after a long pause, reached across the table to touch my hand. His fingers were warm, familiar grounding. "Do you ever wonder," he asked quietly, "what it would have been like if things had been different? If you hadn't had to be so distant?" I held his gaze. Yes, I said softly. More times than I can count, the air between us shifted, not with tension, but with possibility. We were standing on unfamiliar ground, yet neither of us felt the need to step back. Later that evening, after the dishes were cleared, Stanley suggested watching a movie, something we hadn't done together in years. We chose To Kill a Mockingbird, an old classic, and sat side by side on the couch. At first, we kept to ourselves, but as the film went on, I let my head rest lightly against his shoulder. He didn't move away. Instead, he lowered his cheek to my hair. His heartbeat was steady, calm, a sound that anchored me in a way I hadn't felt in years. For the first time, I felt safe, not just physically, but emotionally. Seen, understood, accepted. When the credits rolled, we stayed in silence. "I miss this," he whispered. "Me too," I replied. He lingered that night, not leaving until the moon was high. At the door, he looked into my eyes for a long moment, before asking if I came over more often, not to fix things, not to bring groceries, just to be with you. Would that be okay? I didn't hesitate. "Yes," I said warmly. When he kissed my cheek goodbye, his lips lingered just a fraction longer than usual. Tender, quiet, unspoken. After he left, I stood in the entryway, knowing something had shifted between us. The days that followed were full of thoughts I couldn't untangle. I found myself at the sink, with water running over dishes I had already washed, or folding laundry that belonged to no one anymore. My mind wasn't on the chores, it was on Stanley. Not in a dramatic or forbidden way, but in a gentle, constant presence that filled the silence where grief used to sit. I caught myself smiling at nothing, recalling the feel of his hand in mine, the look in his eyes that told me I was worth knowing again. On Tuesday, he returned. No groceries, no excuses. I was in the neighborhood, he said, but we both knew that wasn't true. We sat on the porch with glasses of sweet tea, watching the wind move through the trees. We talked about music, about his childhood, about the things we had overlooked, sharing for years. He told me about his loneliness as a teenager, how his father's quiet strength sometimes made him feel like he had to be strong too, even when he wasn't. He confessed how he used to sit in the garage, listening to me hum in the kitchen and wonder who I really was. Underneath all the layers of motherhood, I listened, really listened. And something inside me softened in ways I hadn't allowed in decades. Then I told him things too, about the first boy I ever loved before Harold, about how I once dreamed of becoming a painter, about how I used to write poetry, until I stopped because Harold never thought much of it. Stanley grew quiet, his eyes searching mine. Then almost shyly, Stanley reached into his backpack and pulled out a slim notebook. "I've been writing too," he admitted. "I started during the divorce. Just thoughts, feelings." He handed it to me. The cover was worn soft at the edges. I opened it and read a few lines. They were raw, unpolished, but brimming with honesty. Each word felt alive, carrying pieces of his heart. "You're good," I said. My voice caught somewhere between surprise and pride. "Really good." And there it was, his boyish smile. The same one I hadn't seen since he was 16. That night, he stayed for dinner. We cooked together something we hadn't done in years. He chopped vegetables while I stirred sauce, moving around one another with an ease that felt like muscle memory. At one point, our hands brushed as we reached for the same spoon. It was nothing, just a second, but in that second, the room grew louder, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the refrigerator, even the breath in my chest. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us pulled away. After dinner, we chose not to put on a movie. Instead, I set an old jazz record spinning. The soft crackle of the vinyl filled the air, and we sank into the couch. He leaned back, his arm resting across the top, and I found myself leaning in my shoulder against his chest. It felt natural, like we'd done it 1,000 times before, even though we never had. "Do you remember when I broke my arm?" he asked suddenly. Of course I laughed. "You fell out of that sycamore tree trying to impress the neighbor girl. She never even noticed," he chuckled, shaking his head. "But you sat with me all night. You didn't sleep. You just stroked my hair and kept whispering that everything would be all right." My smile softened into something heavier, more tender. "I remember. You were in so much pain." "I wasn't," he said quietly. "Not really. Not after you helped me like that." Silence settled again, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with memory, with something we didn't dare name. Then he turned toward me, brushing a strand of hair gently from my face. It was such a small gesture, yet so filled with care that my heart stumbled. His eyes searched mine, not hungrily, not with expectation, but earnestly, as though asking a question he couldn't put into words. And I answered, not with speech, but with stillness, with openness, by not pulling back. He didn't kiss me. That would have been too much, too soon. Instead, he lowered his forehead to mine. And we stayed that way for a long, quiet stretch of time, breath-mingling hearts steady, the kind of closeness that says more than words ever could. When he finally rose to leave, he lingered uncertain. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, voice shaking slightly. "Neither do I whispered. "But it doesn't feel wrong." He nodded slowly. "It feels like something we were both missing." That night after he left, I sat alone in the dim glow of the living room lamp. My hands rested in my lap, but my heart felt full. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel ashamed of longing for connection. I felt seen, heard, held. The days that followed were quiet, but not the hollow quiet I had known since Harold's passing. This was a gentler kind of quiet, alive, almost expectant, like the air just before the first leaf falls in autumn. I dusted shelves, straightened closets, prepared spaces, not as distraction, but as though I was making room for something. Stanley didn't come the next day, or the day after that. But I wasn't anxious. I knew he would. And when he did, it wouldn't be out of duty. It would be because he wanted to. On Saturday evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in orange and lavender, I heard the familiar knock. 2 taps, a pause. I opened the door. He stood there. No backpack, no groceries, just himself. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying both nerves and hope. "Can I come in? You don't have to ask," I replied. Something in his shoulders eased, and he smiled, quiet, genuine. I stepped aside, and He walked in moving carefully, almost as though it were his first time. I led him to the living room, the same room we'd shared countless times before. But tonight, it felt entirely different. The air between us carried something fragile but electric. We didn't sit apart this time. We sat close, our thighs brushing on the couch, our shoulders touching. He reached for my hand and I let him take it. His thumb traced slow circles against my skin. "I've been thinking," he said quietly, about us, about what we're doing, what we're feeling." I nodded, my heart thudding gently in my chest. "Me too. It scares me," he admitted, his voice low, "because it's not something people would easily understand." I met his gaze. "Do you understand it?" He paused, eyes soft but searching. "I don't know, but I feel it. And it doesn't feel wrong. It feels like healing." That word struck me in a place I didn't even know was still hurting. Healing. Yes, that's what this was. Not a fantasy, not confusion. It was something tender that had grown from years of unspoken care, from the cracks left behind by grief and loneliness. It wasn't born of desperation, but of the longing to be known fully, deeply, without shame. "I don't want to make you uncomfortable," he said, squeezing my hand gently. "If this ever crosses a line—" "You haven't," I said, quickly cutting him off with a breath that trembled. "Michael, you've been more gentle with my heart than anyone in my life." He exhaled, shoulders relaxing, that same quiet relief I'd seen in him as a boy, when a truth finally slipped free. We talked for hours that night about life, about regrets, about choices we never made but always wondered about. He told me he hadn't felt truly close to anyone since his divorce, that he hadn't even let someone hold his hand in over a year, and that sitting next to me felt safer than any relationship he'd known as an adult. And I told him things I'd never said out loud before, about the ache of growing older, the loneliness of being seen only through roles, wife, mother, widow, and never simply as Lisa. When the clock struck midnight, he rose slowly. "I should go," he said, though his voice carried hesitation. "But I don't want to." I stood with him face to face in the warm, dim light. "You can stay," I said softly, before I could second-guess myself. "Just to sleep. Just to be here." He looked at me, searching for something in my eyes. "I'll stay on the couch," he offered gently, as if testing the air between us. "You don't have to," I whispered. "We've already crossed the bridge. We're just walking slowly now." I turned off the lights and led him to my room. We didn't rush. We didn't undress. We simply lay in bed, fully clothed, facing each other in the soft dark, our fingers tangled, our breath synchronized. And in that bed there was no guilt, no weight of judgment, just two souls rediscovering one another, not with urgency, but with open hearts. He kissed my forehead, then my cheek, and then very gently, my lips. It wasn't a kiss of passion, it was a kiss of knowing, of gratitude, of reverence. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking into something both fragile and certain. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel afraid to say it back. "I love you too." That night, we fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, not because we had broken something, but because we had finally begun to repair what had long been fractured. The next morning, he made me tea. kissed my hand at the table, and promised he would be back for dinner. I stood by the window as he left, a quiet smile softening my face, the sun warming my skin, for the first time since Harold's death, maybe even longer than that. I felt whole again. Not because the emptiness had been filled, but because Michael and I had created something new out of what remained. And it was alive,